Hi, everybody. So it's 6 o'clock Warsaw time, and we will be starting the second part of our introductory session. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Erika Lehrer. Erika is a sociocultural anthropologist and curator. She is a professor in the Department of History and Sociology Anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal, where she also is founding director of the Curating and Public Scholarship Lab. She is the author of numerous books and articles that I highly recommend you to read, including Jewish Poland Revisited, Heritage Tourism in Unquiet Places, as well as co-editor of Curatorial Dreams, Critics Imagine Exhibitions, Jewish Space in Contemporary Poland, and Curating Difficult Knowledge, Violent Pasts in Public Spaces. As a curator, she worked on several exhibitions, including Souvenir Talisman Toy at the Krakow Ethnographic Museum in Poland, with the accompanying book Lucky Juice and an online exhibit. She's currently at work on a collaborative project, Awkward Objects of Genocide, which resulted in the exhibition Terribly Close, Polish vernacular artists face the Holocaust, at the same museum last year and 2018. Erika, we are very happy that she agreed to give this keynote lecture at the conference, and I hand the mic to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ola. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, so
yes,
let me just share my screen and make sure that my slides are visible.
Yes, it works.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ola, for that kind introduction, and also to the conference organizers for this really generous invitation to speak. It's incredible pleasure to think together with my Polish colleagues who have made my research life in Poland so incredibly welcoming. Bardzo wam dziękuję. I'm genuinely excited for the next few days for what I think is really a groundbreaking attempt to open a much needed conversation in this part of the world. And I also hope that you all are healthy and safe wherever you are. I feel a bit humbled in the task of setting a tone for our conference. And I'm also conscious of the limitations of this sort of strange new Zoom world. So I hope my impressions will help catalyze discussion over the coming days on the very broad set of issues that might be brought to bear on our shared theme. I'm really eager to hear from our fascinating gathering of museum practitioners and scholars, and hope that together we can start mapping out this understudied terrain. I'm a rather hybrid creature myself, a cultural anthropologist, a student of museums, and an accidental curator. And my work on Jewish heritage has unfolded over many years in Poland. In the last decade, I've been developing an approach to thinking through the museum that involves relationship building among scholars, museums, and communities, and making experimental exhibitions that serve as sites of research, dialogue, and activism. But my path into museums was not obvious. I had been doing ethnographic research in Krakow's historical Jewish quarter of Kazimierz, a site that beginning in the mid-1990s was home to an impressive re-engagement with Poland's Jewish past after many years of its abandonment. As I argued in my book, Jewish Poland Revisited, this site was catalyzed as a platform for productive critical debate, exchange, and cross-cultural learning due to the interaction of local and global forces, and most importantly, the return of a Jewish gaze on the quarter, which involved the collaboration of both Jews and non-Jews from within the country and abroad. When I stopped one day, a few years into my visits to Poland, into the Krakow Ethnographic Museum, also located in the former Jewish quarter, and actually in what was once a Jewish school, I was drawn not by any Jewish-related concerns. Rather, it was because the word ethnography was written on the front door. I was, after all, an ethnographer. But the dissonance between the lively debates about Jewish culture and history that were taking place outside the museum and the silence on the subject that I found inside was stark. This gap, I slowly came to realize, was also a result of the entanglement of multiple sedimented historical structures and forces and their emotional residues that I'm still in the process of unpacking. They relate, of course, to the way that the East Central European region experienced and inherited the legacies of so-called internal colonialisms, of centuries of empire and occupation, often as victims, but also as aggressors. But they also point to East Central Europe as a beneficiary of global European colonialism. In the Polish case, and I'd be very curious to hear if this bears out elsewhere in the region, the museum boom of the early 2000s has attempted to address, and in some cases redress, this internal colonialism with what may be seen as a battle between, and more recently a battle inside of, progressive cosmopolitan museums on the one hand, like the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews or the World War II Museum, and on the other, conservative nationalist museums like the Warsaw Uprising Museum and the Ulma Museum of Poles Saving Jews. These museums that make front page news are new, world-class history museums, packed with the most current curatorial technologies to make their arguments. But there's a landscape of far more numerous, smaller, pre-existing museums, many of whose structures, collections, taxonomies, and epistemologies came into being during Europe's colonial era. These have garnered far less attention, not only in popular, but also in scholarly circles. These institutions tell about the region's implication in the broader European project of overseas colonization. Their collections were often assembled by scientists, explorers, and missionaries whose travels were made possible by the colonial world system, ruled over by governments to the west or to the east. Further, the very idea for and form of such museums share roots with that broader colonial project, one whose goal was to maintain and spread the dominance of Christian Europe in the world. These museums are often sites where local school children learn their first lessons about us and them on a global scale. They are also museums where the histories of Europe's multiple colonialisms, the Holocaust, and state socialism are sedimented in collections that, with a decolonial approach, can help tell the more complicated, deeper, and still mostly untold stories whose legacies continue to define the region. Before I bring you briefly into one corner of one such museum, I want to step back a bit and reflect on some of the travels of the idea of decolonizing museums, which impacted both my own expectations of and my aspirations for this museum in Krakow. The at times rather negative reactions of my Polish museum counterparts to my own personal decolonial project made me realize I was trafficking in some unexamined assumptions, categories, and approaches built into what was becoming an increasingly normalized discourse about decolonizing museums, which I had brought with me from my Canadian home. I've settled on a road trip metaphor today, inspired by cultural studies theorist Mika Ball's notion of a traveling concept, to raise questions about the travels of decolonial museology in East Central European spaces. Ball argues that concepts keep us in a shared conversation, one which is useful not because we agree on the concept's meaning, but precisely because we do not. She describes how in our collective groping to define what concepts mean, we end up showing what they can do. In refusing to discard a concept when it doesn't fit perfectly, and instead staying with the debate, we make difference visible. What might decolonial museology mean? What benefits might it have? And what challenges might it face in East Central Europe? How is the idea both embraced and resisted here? By whom and for whom? And further, how may the travels of the language and practices of decolonial museology in the region refine and improve the idea itself? These questions are at the center of this conference. I decided I wanted to both begin and end the substance of my presentation today with very brief video fragments that touch on African diaspora experience. I do this for two reasons. First, I want to respect the historical moment that we're in, with the Black Lives Matter protests drawing attention to the systemic nature of anti-Black racism and white supremacy. These are issues that belong not only to North America, but are a global legacy of colonialism that deeply implicates the work of museums. And second, I want to keep in constant view a reality that is particularly, but not uniquely challenging in the context of East Central Europe. This is the fact that we cannot fully, meaningfully, or fairly discuss decolonizing museums without the voices of Indigenous, Black, and people of color who have been the biggest victims of the damage that colonial museology has inflicted. Having these conversations without their voices, knowledge, and experience at the center reinscribes the very hierarchies that the decolonial is trying to dismantle. And it also inflicts further wounds precisely where we need repair. So my first clip is maybe familiar to some of you if you work in the museum world or are Hollywood film fans. It's the famous museum scene from the recent Hollywood blockbuster, Black Panther. I'm going to play it now, so you might want to put up your volume a bit.
Good morning. How can I help you?
I was just checking out these artifacts. They tell me you're the expert.
You could say that.
They're beautiful. Where's this one from?
The Bobo Ashanti tribe, present-day Ghana, 19th century.
For real? And what about this one?
That one's from the Edo people of Benin, 16th century.
Now, tell me about this one.
Also from Benin, 7th century, Fula tribe, I believe.
Nah.
I beg your pardon.
It was taken by British soldiers in Benin, but it's from Wakanda, and it's made out of vibranium. Don't trip. I'm gonna take it off your hands for you.
These items aren't for sale.
How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?
Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
This short scene illustrates just a few of the ways that colonial relations are embedded in Euro-American museums, most obviously in their histories of collecting, but also regarding present-day issues of access and physical comfort, hierarchies of knowledge, and the very different kinds of social relevance that museums and their objects have to different communities. Who is made to feel at home in museum space? Whose stories are told? Whose knowledge and experiences are legitimated? Whose values dignified? Whose emotions acceptable? Whose bodies made to feel comfortable? The histories of violence underlying the arrival of objects into museum collections under conditions of empire are undeniable and increasingly being told. But even if large-scale object restitution claims succeed, what about the damage that these institutions may continue to do in forms of symbolic violence? Telling alienating stories about one's own community, having one's knowledge and feelings ignored and denigrated in ways that betray clear continuities with the ideas of racial and cultural hierarchies on which the colonial world turned. These are daily experiences for people of color in establishment museums across Europe and its settler colonies. As the images in this next slide suggest, museums are viewed by decolonial activists as key institutions entangled with and supporting a wide range of forms of racism, oppression, and state violence. In North America, Western Europe, and the UK, recent demands have ranged widely. They have been very specific, like the successful removal of Warren Kanders from his position as vice chairman of the board of the Whitney Museum in New York, because of his ownership of a company that makes tear gas canisters that were used against asylum seekers along the US-Mexican border. And the demands have been more general and still unrealized. Sarah Wajid, who's head of engagement at the Museum of London and a member of Museum Detox, which is a network of people of color who work in museums, notes that in most museums, the place where you see Black staff is in cleaning and security. So the first step towards a decolonized museum is where you have Black and minority ethnic leadership. Calls to decolonize museums have multiple roots, following from broader decolonization movements in the global South and the desire not only to reclaim stolen property, but to throw off colonizers' stories which were used to justify and extend the original oppression and plunder. But museum institutions, which often went from being imperial treasure boxes to national ones, are amazingly good at perpetuating themselves. Indigenous peoples have used museums as major sites of activism. A key part of their increasing social empowerment has been the influence they are gaining over the basic terms for maintaining their material culture in settler origin museums. Indigenous Ho-Chunk scholar Amy Lonetree's 2012 book, Decolonizing Museums, describes this process as exploring how museums can grapple with centuries of unresolved trauma, how they can honor Indigenous worldviews and ways of knowing, challenging stereotypical representations, and how they can speak hard truths of colonization within exhibition spaces to address the persistent legacies of historical unresolved grief in Native communities. As you can see from this word cloud that I made with key terms from a variety of decolonial museum manifestos, it's clear that the idea of decolonizing museums refers to a vast array of activities. Unsurprisingly, there are also important debates about this very proliferation of decolonial discourse in museum circles. One question is whether museums are actually possible to decolonize at all. As British researcher Sumaya Kasim has asked with great skepticism. Museums' deep implication in structures of colonial thought and categories, and their need to please funders, their entrenched institutional processes of work, and their fear of creating discomfort among visitors are major barriers to change. Similarly, there has been strong pushback against draining the term decolonizing of its power as linked to ongoing Indigenous battles to reclaim their stolen land and sovereignty. As Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang put it in their 2012 article, Decolonization is not a metaphor. With due respect to these important limitations and concerns, I turn again to Mika Ball's notion of traveling concepts. If we commit to an open, self-reflexive process, rather than diluting or distraction or de-engagement, the in any case inevitable travels of the decolonial debate offer an important opportunity for both differentiation and solidarity that can benefit museum theory and practice. There is ample evidence that East Central Europe has been imprinted with a shared European colonial worldview regarding white supremacy. One can see it in the imagery of classic Polish children's book like Julian Tuwim's 1935 Little Black Bambo, Murzynek Bambo, and Henryk Sienkiewicz's 1911 In the Desert and in the Wilderness, with their paternalistic depictions of Africa embodied by happy, quote, savage children and their civilizing white counterparts. And colonialism's enduring legacies are visible in the perpetuation of such imagery today, in everything from cakes to costumes to children's classroom activities. And I regret here that I'm missing an image of the Native American headdress printed on the menu that my Canadian colleagues borrowed from the Sioux restaurant, that's S-I-O-U-X for the indigenous tribe, on the main square in Krakow. One could collect many more such images. But let's come back to the Jewish neighborhood of Kazimierz and to the Krakow Ethnographic Museum, established in 1911. I cannot do justice to this fascinating, complex institution in this short talk, nor to the very warm relationships that I've built with its staff in recent years. I invoke it today because it was here, beginning in the mid-1990s, that I had my own version of the Black Panther scene. I was confronted with objects, including those you see here, which represent Jews through the eyes of Catholic Polish peasants, including masks, comical rocking wooden figurines, figural beehives, and a photograph of a straw effigy of Judas hanging from a tree, meant to be beaten, burned, and drowned. They were, until very recently, exhibited with no critical context. I also saw an imagined Polish village society and economy, which in reality would likely have been 30, 50, maybe even 70% Jewish, not to mention a Roma and a Ukrainian population, for example, and others, depicted as almost exclusively Polish Catholic. My own Polish Jewish family lived in villages just like these. You can see that one of them, the village of Otynia, had twice as many Jews as Catholic Poles. A number of frames are necessary to understand this museum's particular configuration of unproblematized anti-Semitism on display in its permanent exhibition of Polish folk culture, on the one hand, and the erasure of Poland's historically prominent Jewish population from it, on the other. Regarding the stereotypical images I showed a minute ago, they can hang uncritically on the wall, in part because of the power of a century-old Christian world anti-Semitic visual culture that is so deeply embedded in dominant European culture as to be unremarkable to many. The anti-Semitic racialization of Jews by the Nazis in the 1930s, which, as this slide illustrates, was informed by colonial white supremacist racial science, borrowed in part from the United States and their eugenicists, who were trying to restrict the non-white population through both birth and immigration, is another part of the missing context for those folk cultural items that post-date the Nazi era. Finally, the lack of a confident, empowered present-day Jewish community in Krakow who might have taken issue with this kind of presentation is another different piece of the puzzle. But why are actual Jews and their culture largely missing from this museum? Again, the answer is multi-layered. The 19th century discipline of ethnography in Central and Eastern Europe was supported by elites under the Austro-Hungarian Empire who were interested in gaining national territorial autonomy. Museum collections helped make visual arguments for distinct ethnic traits, which in turn supported claims to statehood. The lack of Jews here as ethnographic subjects mirrors their uncertain and sometimes outright unwanted place in the vision of the Polish nation. It also says something more about disciplinary categories because one only has to go down the street to the historical museum to see an essentialized Jewish religious culture defined in sort of artistic terms, confined to the old synagogue building. But further, if Jews were simply not ethnographic in 19th century Polish terms, after World War II and the Holocaust, the post-war communist government's cultural policies supported a general silence and anxiety about this recently murdered 10th of their pre-war population. Because of my hybrid job description, I'm always looking for opportunities for curatorial experimentation in the museums that I critique. Collection-based museums in particular have such rich potential to tell plural stories. If we're only willing to discard narrow disciplinarity and invite a fuller human experience that includes all the missing viewpoints that are implicated in these objects' full biographies. From their points of creation to their travels into museum collections, as well as the resonances they have for the range of communities implicated in what they represent. The most basic decolonial approach is to invite groups of people who have been excluded to add their own knowledge to how these objects are represented and interpreted. One contribution that East Central European museums can make to the discourse of decolonial museology is to help develop a vocabulary for the range of relationships that objects from the region may have to the various communities, given the region's particular history. A history that the dominant decolonial museum discourse, with its emphasis on often overseas source communities, may not capture. Now, I wanted to show just two quick examples of a theoretical and curatorial proposition that I've been working on to suggest how museums might express complex historical relationships with their collections in ways that undo the epistemic violence of colonial categorizations of people and objects, and move towards the emancipatory potential of a decolonial museum. The idea relates to what I call communities of implication. And here I'm borrowing from Michael Rothberg's theory of implicated subjects, which points to the way that we're all tangled up in histories and situations that surpass our agency as individuals. In the present slide, you see a group of wooden noisemakers on display in the spring customs room of the Krakow Museum's permanent exhibition of Polish folk culture. The only interpretive material presents these as Catholic Polish terkotkas, or kołatkas, used in Easter ritual processions or in place of bells to call people to church. Yet they could just as easily, as this second photo shows, be Jewish grogers, used by local children each time the villain Haman's name is said during the traditional reading of the Book of Esther in the Jewish holiday of Purim. That's what they looked like to me, having played with similar ones as a child in the USA. A very small interpretive intervention could reframe these objects, not in terms of simple provenance or some kind of normative function, but of implication. With the addition of an explanatory label connecting the two traditions that employ the object, historical and contemporary photos of the two religious communities using them, or reminiscences from Jewish and Catholic individuals who played with them. This kind of addition could remind museum visitors that prior to World War II, Poland was, and to a very small extent still is today, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Doing so would place Jews within the story of Polish culture, from which they have in significant ways been erased. It would also challenge the common myth that Jews lived entirely separate social lives from their Catholic neighbors, a misconception held equally by Poles and foreign Jews. The display would instead tell a challenging story of cultural proximity, exchange, and hybridity, including a story of cultural boundary maintenance via mutual prejudice, as well as anti-Jewish symbolic and real violence, as these noisemakers were used in the spring Christian custom known as the burning of Judas. An implication-minded approach would challenge both communities to understand their cultures in more expansive ways than those that colonial-era ethnographic presentations and nationalist narratives have encouraged, and to acknowledge the contemporary political, educational, and emotional impact that such museums have. Similar treatments could be applied to many areas of social and cultural life that are or could be exhibited, from carpentry to paper cutting, money lending to innkeeping. Another different kind of object that begs a pluralist, implicated approach is a widespread but largely forgotten genre of so-called folk art that has been essentially lost in the archives of Polish ethnographic and folk museums. Mostly from the 1960s and 70s, these artworks represent the Nazi occupation of Poland and the Holocaust. Rarely displayed, these works are unsettling documents that in their symbolic constitution implicate multiple communities. This example here is Polish carver Zygmunt Skrętowicz's bas-relief entitled Gassing, which is part of a series dedicated to Auschwitz. They depict various forms of the various forms of murder perpetrated by the Germans. Does it make sense to consider such a work as part of Polish heritage alone, as such works have typically been classified in these museums? Collaborative research with my Polish colleagues tells a fascinating story of Polish makers and German collectors drawn together to make sense of the difficult memory of the Holocaust that linked them in an ambivalent commemorative industry. In telling these objects broader biographies, we begin to free them from the multiple silencing forces at the intersection of post-Holocaust trauma, post-socialist political culture, and post-colonial epistemology and curatorial strategies that bear down on many museums in the region. I have been fascinated by the Krakow Museum's new slogan since 2008, "My Museum, a Museum About Me." As a curator, I have taken this as an ongoing provocation to make it feel true to myself. The very mode of address of this statement, "My Museum, a Museum About Me," begs the question that I think must be at the heart of every decolonial encounter with museum narratives, namely, who is speaking? Who is this me that would feel this statement is true? Such subtle linguistic gestures on museum walls help tell us who these institutions are there for and who they both imagine and want their audiences to be. As a North American Jewish anthropologist, I am, of course, coming from abroad. Yet the way my difference has been defined is another layer of the museum's implicit narrative. In conversations and published texts, I have been characterized as an outsider to this museum's culture and epistemology on both ethnic and disciplinary grounds. In professional conversations, my ethnicity has been taken as evidence that I am a uniquely biased observer and that my decolonial framework has been labeled as Western and neo-colonial. I cherish the dialogues that I've had with my Polish counterparts, which have stretched my thinking and help continue to reveal my own blind spots. There are dangers of neocolonialism and Orientalization experienced by East Central Europeans. And I have not always been aware of these. Nor am I always sensitive sufficiently to the real risks, to jobs and to institutional funding that trying to make this kind of change requires, particularly in the current political context. But the many years during which I was informed that my interpretations were incorrect and my theoretical frameworks inappropriate suggest the use of outmoded disciplinary categories to maintain an inherited status quo that is poorly suited to today's social challenges. Polish philosopher Andrzej Lehrer has done important work on the massive but psychologically undigested transformation of Polish society between 1939 and 1956. And it's a major contribution to the decolonial question in this region, which has bearing on museums like this one. The extermination of the Jews and the Stalinist elimination of the remaining elites and the filling of these social gaps by others made Poles beneficiaries of violence they may not have directly committed. Lehrer has also argued that narrow, positivistic approaches to knowledge can function as a shield against moral realizations. It is, he suggests, only through enduring the discomfort of acknowledging another's framework, putting yourself in doubt by looking at yourself through others' eyes, that one may truly empathize. As promised, I will end with a final minute of video, this time a piece of an irreverent comedy sketch, but one with serious implications. The clip shows an African-American guy from Detroit being introduced to his rural Polish in-laws' Christmas holiday traditions. Now, it's important to give a couple of caveats here. The so-called Krampus character portrayed in this clip is a mashup of a variety of Central European mythological wintertime demons. So it doesn't map perfectly onto the Polish context. This is, of course, a comedy sketch. But it does share aspects with a range of disturbing seasonal folk customs presented in Polish ethnographic museums. More to the point, the cross-cultural confrontation, while here set up for comic relief, suggests, I think, useful lessons for decolonial museum practice in a globalized world.
That's real VC.
I'm so glad Shay could join us for a traditional Polish Christmas.
Please, sit down.
Yeah, all right.
Ah, well, I hope you don't find our Polish Christmas tradition strange.
Oh, of course not. I mean, who doesn't like pounding shots of vodka over the holiday?
Oh my. Could it be? The Krampus?
What the f is a Krampus?
It's kind of like the Polish Santa.
Come in.
Oh, hell no.
Finally, the Krampus has chosen us.
Somebody's been naughty this year.
Oh yeah, you've been a bad.
That's the Polish Santa?
Sort of.
Who's the Moor?
Who are you calling a Moor?
You and Moor.
Well, this is my husband, Krampus. It's his first Polish
Yes,
Christmas.
Krampus, no. I have something for you. This is a gift. A walking stick, hewn from Warsaw oak.
No, I'm from the streets, man. I ain't playing with shit.
Do you like it? Oh!
God damn it, stop.
It's tradition.
This video, which I've watched countless times, has great emotional resonance for me. It recalls some of my own feelings standing in the Winter Customs Gallery of the Krakow Ethnographic Museum, face to face with anti-Semitic stereotypes, and being told that the problem was not on the wall, but in me. Thankfully, after many years and many kinds of work together with the Krakow Museum, in fall 2019, the most challenging display was recurated, and a new text in a new kind of voice now questions the innocence of the masks that I showed earlier, describes the anti-Semitism that they support, and asks whether the museum has sufficiently taken care of the perspectives of its Jewish and also its Roma visitors. The new display has also replaced the masks and their visceral ability to hurt with small-scale archival photographs. We live increasingly and irreversibly in mobile global community. The galleries in our museums are profoundly cross-cultural spaces whose objects implicate many groups and worldviews across time and space and teach our children how to view difference. In East Central Europe in particular, space is needed to tell the many suppressed local and national stories. But we must welcome the new critical gazes that new communities will inevitably bring to bear on our own cultural traditions. These traditions often contain threads of sexuality, violence, misogyny, heteronormativity, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, and white supremacy. These are easily disavowed when wrapped in cherished family and community rituals, and they become invisible when those they implicate are not present or not empowered to speak. Given the global challenges we face, museums must transcend their shared European origins as tools to support the domination and exclusion of non-white others. A fear-mongering project that is on the rise on both sides of the Atlantic. It is up to us to push them to embrace their emancipatory potential as spaces of empathy, solidarity, and creativity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erica, for this inspiring lecture. I think it's framing many issues that we will be probably discussing during these upcoming days. And I also see there are already some requests for links to the videos that you showed. So if after we finish the Q&A session, I would be like, could you please like post the links in the chat box so that everybody who wants to then view it later could do it. And now we can enter a short Q&A session. And I'm very happy that there's over 100 of us here. But because of that, we will ask you to post your questions in the chat box, and I will be picking them up and asking questions to Erica. So yeah, I see there is a question, already one question by Armando Perla. As you have, I'm just going to read it now. As you have mentioned, inviting people to add their knowledge to museums from where they have been excluded. However, Sumaya Kasim has spoken greatly on the emotional labor this implies. Puawai Kynes, I hope I read it correctly, so apologies if I can't do it, has also said the co-option of decolonization as the latest trendy cultural theory and praxis by mainstream organization ran the very real danger of locking indigenous people into a death dance with the colonial structures, with its demands that we work and labor until we are completely consumed. How can we ensure that this isn't the case in the decolonial work museum are trying to do? How can we stop using decolonizing museology to legitimize white institutions instead to actually benefit those living the colonial difference? Why we are decolonizing? Is it to benefit the institution, museum, professionals, or academics, or historically marginalized communities? End of question.
Great, thank you so much, Armando. And I know I've already been in somewhat of a conversation with Armando, and I hope to be in a lifelong conversation with him about museums and these issues. I mean, I think, you know, as I said early on, I would love to hear from the people of color who are doing this work about what it is that they need to make sure that they don't get exhausted from the emotional labor. Speaking from my, you know, this kind of in-between perspective, doing my own very many year, very emotional labor with the Krakow Ethnographic Museum and a number of colleagues there, I would say that I think that dialogue is really important and collaboration is really important so that we spread the work around. You know, it's really taken many years to create understandings on both sides of this divide. And I can tell you actually that, you know, I had a conversation with a curator with whom I had really great conflicts with earlier on. About 4 years after the fact of my first exhibition there, she reached out and asked me to go for a coffee, and we ended up talking for about 4 hours. And you know, she really asked me, she wanted to really understand my experience. And it was incredibly emotionally important for me and very useful. So I think in some ways there's no way around the hard, long work that this takes to do. I think that sharing the work is the way to do it. The question of the decolonial being co-opted, yes, I mean, as I mentioned earlier on, I had this tuck and yang issue in my mind. I mean, look, there are many struggles going on, and I can tell you simply that in my experience, this tool of the idea of decolonial, which fits, you know, in some ways quite awkwardly in this region where I'm using it, nevertheless has actually been incredibly useful, both for forwarding some of what I do see as emancipatory projects for the many people who are implicated in these stories and objects. But it's also revealed so much more that is difficult, so many more structures and practices and assumptions that we need to discuss. And so I think that, of course, you know, we don't want to willy-nilly make comparisons or take important struggles and use them for for things that may seem superficial or simply not closely enough related. And I should point out that there are also incredible debates about the value and use and problems of these kinds of comparisons and metaphors in general. But I do think that actually the travels of the concept are useful, and they can do a lot of useful stuff in terms of creating thinking for new practices, and also refining the idea itself, and what can its use and power be. Thanks for the question.
There's also another question about the use of critical whiteness studies in epistemic decolonization in Eastern Europe. Would you like to share some thoughts about that?
I mean, I think I can't really speak to that. That's not my area of expertise. I can tell you that I've seen very recently calls for papers and new volumes coming out that deal with issues, for example, of feminism and critical whiteness in decolonial terms in the region. So I do know that that's a conversation that's happening, but apologies, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, thanks so much. So another question is Decolonizing Museums an attempt to undo European Orientalism? Is it an attempt to motivate universal culture and doing away with cultural diversity?
I hope not. I mean, again, I think one project that I hope we're starting in this conversation is to understand, the many different ways that the idea of the decolonial in museums is being used in the region. So I can't speak to all of them, and we're just beginning to map those out, which is so important. But I want to say I was actually listening in on Monday. There was a conversation at Cornell University about object restitution. And there was this really useful notion about a kind of relational, I think the term, if I'm correct, was relational universalisms. So about where, we're in dialogue with each other, and there isn't just one point of, it's not a true universalism where one point of view wipes out all the others, but there's a structure of dialogue and exchange.
Thanks a lot. And another question appeared. Do you have an example of being confronted with your own blind spots and how you managed this? And thank you for a wonderful keynote.
Oh my gosh, I have so many examples of being confronted with my own blind spots. I mean, I don't know, I could talk about this over a process of years. I mean, from the one thing that I wrote about in my first book was, coming as a Jewish person with Polish roots from abroad, the sense that Nazi concentration camps in Poland were something that was exclusively targeted at Jews. I mean, when I was 20 years old, I had this incredible, exchange with someone who actually was from the town of Auschwitz, actually, which is a town beyond the camp. And, him asking me about just this realization that, the camp, even though this camp was made, was, ultimately mostly for the extermination of Jews, that there were many, many Polish people, and that, most families in Poland were touched by people who also were interned in concentration camps and often murdered there. So, I mean, there are major blind spots like that. And then there are also blind spots of the kind that I mentioned briefly about, being so fixated on what I saw as, a decolonial and an anti-Semitic project in this or other museums, and, not thinking sufficiently about what it would mean under a moment, especially when there's a very radically right-wing government in power in Poland, to try to make some of these changes in the museum, which would be very politically unpalatable. And well, what would that risk for these people's jobs or for the funding for the museum? And so, it might be correct, and it might be what I think should happen immediately for some changes to be made, but that actually could be very risky. And I think over time, I started to realize that what I saw sometimes as resistance on the part of this museum might be reframed as a kind of progressive self-censorship, where the museum actually, in being willing to be in dialogue and collaboration with me, opening the door a crack, I could help them as an outsider doing things that maybe they actually were too risky for them to do as an insider. So those are a couple of examples.
Thanks a lot. Another one is, have you encountered emancipatory museums in East Central Europe?
I mean, I don't know if I could speak to like a museum in total, but of course there's amazing work being done. I know most specifically Poland, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from outside, from the other countries. But I mean, I should say, first of all, the Krakow Ethnographic Museum itself has been doing amazing work. I mean, they did a really interesting exhibition on wedding traditions, in which they included, they included some examples of like wedding costumes and current traditions, and they included a gay couple being married, which in the current Polish political context, that's actually quite that's quite a risk taking. So there's also museums in Warsaw. I'm thinking about the Zamek Ujazdowski, this kind of modern, current art, contemporary art museum that's done incredible, different kinds of feminist and other sorts of critical museology. And I mean, one could say that the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which, there's been lots of really generative critiques of it, that itself is in some ways an incredible unerasure of the whole history of Polish Jews, which, had not been spoken about in a meaningful way under, the previous 50 years. So there's so much going on. I mean, I might also, I should mention, in terms of other things going on in the region, Piotr Piotrowski, who in 2011 did this amazing project where he did a short-lived project as the director of the Warsaw National Art Museum, where he tried to institute a model of something that he theorized as a critical museum. So not just critiquing museums, but that the museum would be critical itself. He called it a muzeum krytyczne. And there's a book about that in a co-edited volume. Actually, one of our speakers, I think on the final round table, Katarzyna Murawska-Mutiesius, can speak about that. So yeah, a short-lived attempt to essentially recenter the region to sort of decolonize Eastern Europe in art historical terms. And they did an amazing exhibition called Ars Homo Erotica, which was taking Western art history and looking at it through a queer lens. And that was incredibly important. And of course, he then lost his job. So, those risks really become visible in that example.
Yeah, we have a comment from Katarzyna Murawska-Mutiesius saying that this was in 2010.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so we have two more extensive questions. So the first one is, considering colonial collections on science and natural history museums, how the decolonizing museum collection concept can be adopted when you cannot reverse the past in face of the nature of objects and artifacts exhibited and the history associated to them, science expedition, evangelization, and so on.
Okay, if I hope I'm understanding the question correctly. So basically, when you have a really problematic collection, how do you exhibit it? I have to say, I know my friends will laugh because I invoke this all the time in all situations, but there's this really generative concept by scholars Corey Kratz and Ivan Karp, who they write about this in this Ray Silverman volume called Museum as Process, which I think was 2014, called the interrogative museum, I think, or interrogative curating. And they have a concept of, or a practice of exhibiting the problem. And basically, I think it's such a useful tool, and it functions in so many situations where if you have something problematic, rather than trying to solve the problem or get rid of the problem, you make the problem the center of the exhibition. Because in a sense, the first thing that we really want to do is we need to make visible the harm that was done, right? We don't want to erase our own histories of very problematic uses of museums. We want to make that history visible and do better. And I'm thinking here also of maybe a similar predecessor concept was James Clifford's idea that these 19th century museums should be put in museums, because those museums and their problematic collections and even their problematic displays are part of our heritage that we need to work through and take responsibility for. So I think I would love to see the collection and have a conversation about it, but I think that there are lots of things that you can do to display really difficult subject matter.
The person who asked the question also added the context of colonial restitution concept. Could you also refer to that?
I mean, that is a huge concept and process, as Joanna Wawrzyniak mentioned in the beginning. There's been this, I guess, what's been seen as a watershed moment with the Sars-Savoy report, which came from French President Emmanuel Macron's call that these African objects should not only be shown in Paris and in France, but should be shown in in Benin, in Cameroon, in Nigeria, etc. I mean, what to say about it? It's a process which is now beginning. It's maybe the fundamental process of decolonizing museums is giving back the often ill-gotten and sometimes very violently gotten collections that inhabit establishment museums across Europe, America, and the whole, post-colony. I think, one part of this that maybe touches on my own work is when you have these, very, very layered, complex situations like in East Central Europe, where you have colonial collections, and I think we're just discovering where those are. I noticed that there are some convents, for example, that have Inuit collections, and I'm not sure, we want to map that out, but also have these layers of then, objects that were plundered, Jewish objects that were plundered by the Nazis, and non-Jewish objects, and then things that were plundered by state socialism. And so, so many layers. I think I'm going to leave, ideas about, how that will all unfold to people who are real experts on it. But I do think that it's worth thinking a little bit about the ways that object restitution is not a global solution to all the problems of colonial museums. Because if we simply, give back all the objects, I think I was mentioning this a bit in my talk, it actually can make museums feel like they've done their job already, and then not look at some of the other ways in which they are continuing sort of to use these colonial categories and make people still very excluded or use really oppressive representations of them. And also, there's a way, I can't remember, I've listened to a number of conversations among scholars of object restitution, talking about the ways that giving back the objects can then end up making the museums who were the ones who did the original crimes seem very heroic. It can further dignify them and once again make them the heroes. So this is all to say that I think the kinds of work that I've been discussing, and I gave you just these couple examples, but really to thinking about, and hopefully over the next few days listening to, what kind of curatorial work and what kind of internal work, not only curating, but also, how are things categorized, and also whose voices are brought to bear in these museums, what kinds of consultations are being done with communities, who is on the staff of these museums, are there people who represent the various communities that are implicated in their collections. These are all issues that I think need to be held in parallel with the question of object restitution.
Thank you, Erica. We have 4 more questions on our list, and I think this will be like the last 4 questions we're going to go through. So thank you so much, everybody, for posting the questions in the chat. We are also documenting it, so Erica, you can also go through all the questions and see who was actually asking what.
I would love to
do that. Yeah. So we have one more, one question: is Decolonizing Museum a way to recapture the modern imperial stories? The statement "My museum about me" probably was the ruling class or imperial power attempt to explain their imperial success. Is the Decolonizing Museum contradict the modern imperial agenda?
I'm not entirely fully sure that I understand the question, but I did want to just clarify. I feel like maybe my reference to that, the "My Museum" slogan was maybe I didn't give enough context to it. That actually, this is part of what's so fascinating to me about that statement, is that was actually in 2008, the Krakow Ethnographic Museum, made this kind of, leap forward. They got a new director, and there was a lot of, change was afoot to in a museum that in fact had not changed very much, for the past 50 years. And so this new slogan, "My Museum About Me," I understood, and I think there's been some writing about that, to be a gesture, really like a kind of postmodern museological gesture. So this is no longer an authoritative museum where some sort of high and mighty authorities and are going to be telling people what it is about, and that it's going to be community engaged and open, and that everyone should feel like it's their own museum. And I think the museum actually did a lot of really interesting kind of activist participatory projects in the neighborhood with marginalized communities, and also trying to fill some of those sort of blank spots to make it somewhat more inclusive. It's just that myself, with my my particular angle, I felt like, but me, that does not feel like actually my museum. And so I've really been using that to try to, to try to expand the conversation about who the museum actually can include. So I think it was actually a progressive attempt. I think it was just not fully realized, let's say.
Thank you. How would you respond to the popular argument that Eastern Europe had a non-colonizer history, and therefore the decolonization as it has been developed is not applicable or has to be highly reconfigured in the case of Eastern Europe? What are the geographical differences and constraints of a specific Western concept of decolonization as regards to Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that's the question of this whole conference, and I think we'll probably be better positioned to, to try to address it at the end of our 4 days rather than at the beginning. But I think, one thing I tried to do in my talk is show that that of course the concept needs to be reconfigured. Yeah, that is what our work is here. But I don't think that means by any means that some of the main issues of decolonizing museums don't also apply in the region, and also even beyond museums. I mean, I showed you these images of, these classic sort of white supremacist, racist stereotypes that I had to Google for 2 seconds in Poland to find, these things are visitable, names of cafes, kinds of cake, they're children. I mean, preschool children being taught to make sort of little black Sambo masks and dress up in blackface and do dance and things like that. I mean, it's so clear that sort of the classic overseas European Christian colonial project is, very much, the legacies of that are very much shared in the region. Also, and I'm very excited about this conference doing that, mapping out the colonial era collections that are spread across the region, and having scholars begin to tell those histories of, well, what were the conditions that brought those objects here? And I think there are, there will be really useful diversities. So, oftentimes Polish explorers or scientists simply went on, say, French or Russian colonial expeditions. And so, were fully implicated in all of those power relations. But also sometimes, and this is another thing that my wonderful colleague Magdalena Zich at the Ethnographic Museum in Krakow has been working on and telling me about, that there were also people who were exiles, for example, Polish exiles in Siberia, also then under very different kinds of power relations in different terms, collected objects from among the indigenous people in that area, which then have ended up in the collection. So I think that there's a lot of careful work that needs to be done. But I think one of my, I just feel really strongly that pointing to the difference of the region should not, overshadow the fact that there are also similarities, and much as there might be tensions and inequalities between East and West, that's not a reason to pretend that these things are not also shared.
Thanks a lot, Erica. So we have one question and one comment. How to make the colonization discourse less confrontational and more productive? How to include various stakeholders and points of views effectively? Yeah,
that's such an important question. I mean, I've had my own whole journey of sort of moving from, kind of confrontation to collaboration with the Krakow Museum, which has been, really the kind of one of the central dramas of my life, my professional life at least, and really wonderful experience, humbling and inspiring. I think, one of the most recent kind of events or unfoldings of this project has been my collaboration with a local community-based cultural arts activism organization called Festivalt, which is it's a Jewish arts activist organization in Krakow. And I think so far my engagement with the Krakow Museum has been sort of the museum, them, and then the academic, me. And when I mentioned this sort of thinking through the museum process that I've been developing with my Canadian colleagues, the incredibly important missing piece is communities, right? And so how do you bring in those community voices to make sure that there's broad representation for people who have a stake in these museums, their collections, and their representations. And so what Festivalt has allowed me to do is, I think in some ways without them, I might have kind of come to the end of my ability to engage with the museum. I had, we had some conflicts. I had written critically about them. Some of, people from the museum had written critically about me. I did a couple of exhibitions, some with the support of the museum, but it had sort of started to peter out, I think. But Festivalt sort of enabled a whole new conversation and also a kind of way of relating to open up that went beyond what I could do as a critical scholar. And they also have this incredible network of local Jewish community people and also people from abroad to start doing. So then we started doing walkthroughs with people from the Jewish community, so who could write, for example, on sticky notes and put, we actually invited them to put critical commentary on an exhibition that I had done with my Polish colleagues. So we started trying to make it not confrontational, because we were asking them to critique our own attempts here. And in fact, we're working on something now with Festivalt where some artists, some of them, but not all Jewish, are going to be in collaboration with the museum doing a kind of a critical projection on the facade of the museum, hopefully this December. So yeah, I think partnership is essential here. Partnership and collaboration, inviting, seeking out partners of all sorts, if you're situated in museums. So scholars, community members, activists, there are probably people who would really love to, have an influence on what your museum is doing, and searching them out and making ways to listen really and to hear what they have to say. And again, I hope this conference is going to be a first step in showing some of the ways that can happen here.
Thanks. Before I ask the last question, I wanted to share with you a comment, so you can see it later in the documentation of the chat. But there is a comment regarding the word Ukrainians, because in the past they were actually called Ruthenians, so Rushini. So this is like a note from a person in the chat. And the last question is how we can reflect about the Colonial Museum if the actual concept of museum is so Eurocentric. It isn't necessary, isn't it necessary to redefine the concept of museum first? Quoting the quote, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house."
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to use that line in my talk, but you beat me to it. Yeah, I mean, look, this kind of decolonial museum project that I'm talking about, it is a project to rework what the museum is fundamentally. It's not just, I mean, that's why I'm saying, object restitution, that doesn't solve the problem, because you still have the basic mechanism, structure, process of the colonial museum in place. So yes, decolonizing museums, I think, speaks to this need to entirely reconfigure what a museum is for, really, and who it is for, and the kinds of things that it can do. That said, I want to revisit, Sumaya Kasim's comment that, the question whether museums actually can be decolonized. It's an open question. I think that, from my experience and from the reading that I've done and the things that I've seen, they can certainly be changed in more emancipatory ways. But I don't know how far that can go, and so I think it's really useful to keep in mind that there are people who have really been on the receiving end of the kind of violence that these museums have done and still can do, who say, you know what, I have no use for museums. Like, why would I possibly, imagine being an Indigenous person whose, objects maybe have been taken and treated completely not in the way that is culturally appropriate to that culture, and a generation of their own community knowledge that was basically embedded in those objects has been kept from them. I mean, the whole concept of what a museum is, that may not just be something that such a person possibly would want to perpetuate. And so I think that it also depends who you ask. And again, that's the fundamental question in all of this, is like, who are we talking about? I think it would be completely understandable for a person whose own community heritage has been taken away and misused in a colonial museum, to think that that is just not an institution that has their best interests at heart. And they don't want to engage any further.
Thanks a lot, Erica, and thanks a lot to you all for your amazing questions and comments that you posted in the chat, and also sharing links and references. This is really precious, and thanks a lot for that. Erica, you can see all that later. Thanks again for your inspiring lecture. And we are very happy that you agreed to do that. And I think this was a great idea to open this conference and a few days of discussion.